So Sony's just announced the A1 or the Alpha one, and holy crap. Now, normally I don't talk about cameras until I get my hands on them and have had some actual real world experiences with them. I'm not a full-time YouTube camera reviewer. I just talk about the cameras and the gears that I actually use in the real world. But this one is just too big of a launch to ignore, and I thought I'd have to go through and talk about some of the specs that we're seeing here. This is Sony's flagship camera, and I can't help but think that this is one giant middle finger at the Canon R5. Now, to be fair, this is definitely a competitor against the Canon 1DX. It's not so much of a competitor against the R5, and it reflects that based on, well, the price for starters. It's $6,500 US dollars. And also with the labeling, it doesn't have a 7 or a 9 in front of its name. It starts with a 1. So this is obviously something very special for them. This is their new flagship lineup. So when so many YouTubers refer to the Canon R5 as the holy grail camera, well, what the hell does that make this Sony A1? But what exactly is this camera for? Who is it for? What is it aimed at doing? What does it compete against? Will it overheat? Well, let's have a look at some of these specs and see what information we can find out from them. I'm not going to go through everything, just the specs that I find interesting or relevant to what I do. It has a 50.1 megapixel stack sensor that can shoot up to 30 frames per second, which is absolutely insane. However, the 30 frames per second does come with a bit of a caveat. Under normal shooting modes, you can shoot up to 20 frames per second. So if you want to shoot, I believe, uncompressed or lossless RAW, you need to be shooting at 20 frames per second, which it's still plenty fast in terms of what I do. But if you want to go with that 30 frames per second, there are certain settings and I believe even lenses that you need to be using for it to be compatible with that high plus continuous shooting mode. So it does come with a little bit of a caveat there. So it's fair to say that its maximum shooting mode is somewhere between 20 and 30 frames per second. The camera is scheduled to be launched in March 2021, and as I said before, its retail price will be at $6,500 US dollars, which is around, I believe, the same price as the 1DX when that was launched. So that really proves that this is a camera that is aimed to compete against that top tier professional cameras. It is a camera that, according to the specs, seems to be a dual camera. It's a bit of a change from Sony's other usual lineup. So the body is slightly changed. It's going to be a little bit beefier from what I'm reading here. It says here it's going to have a slightly bigger body, better weather sealing, a tilt screen in comparison to a flip screen. I assume that has something to do with the ruggedness and the maybe heat dissipation, weather sealing as well. It's got other slight body changes as well in terms of a new dial at the top as well. So this is to reflect the fact that this is going to be a pro camera with a pro body. It makes sense that being an A1 and not a camera that has a 7 or a 9 in front of it, that it's going to be something different. In comparison with the Nikon and the Canon versions, like the Canon 1DX, for instance, I once had a 1DS Mark II, and the body is just completely different when it comes to the 1D series. It is a no holds barred, nothing compromised, absolute brick of a unit of a body and build construction, and hopefully we're going to see something similar like this to this new Sony A1 series. It supports pixel shift at 200 megapixels, which I don't exactly highly rate, and I think that the pixel shift feature is targeted towards me. I shoot billboards for car manufacturers, so we do a lot of slow choreographed stage photography with very specific lighting, where we can shoot with an entire day to do one specific layout with the camera locked down on the tripod. And I don't find that pixel shift is something very practical for what I do. I have done some tests with pixel shift using my Sony A7R Mark IV, and I find that the benefits of shooting in pixel shift is just so negligible and insignificant. The main difference out of what we do with the camera locked down on the tripod is that we can shoot with bracketing, so we've got high dynamic range, we can reduce the amount of noise, and we can blend exposures with different lighting techniques. However, pixel shift doesn't seem to really help that much when it comes to the real world practical effects of what we do. So I don't particularly rate it, but at least they have it, and it's a feature that they include. Now, the big deal here to me is that it has dual format card slots. Not only do you get 2 card slots, but both card slots support CF Express Type A cards or the traditional UHS Type 2 SD cards. And both card slots can support both card formats, which is absolutely fantastic. If there was a dream camera that was no compromised and would do the exact formats that I want. In particular, it would be exactly what this Sony A1 is doing. I love using the UHS-2 cart slots. It is an amazing balance between price and capacity and speed and compatibility in my mind. So I use and live off the UHS 2 SD card slots. The CF Express Type A cards are more newer, more next-gen cards, and it makes sense that it supports both of them, but it's backwards compatible with the UHS 2 SD card slot, so it's an absolute dream, and you can mix and match the two. It'll even, as I'll discuss later, support redundant video recording on both cards at the same time. It supports IBIS, or in-body stabilization, up to 5.5 stops, which in comparison to the Canon seems to be a little bit weaker than what the Canon R5 is capable of doing. But with video, it's certainly bringing its fists up against the R5. It does 8K 30 frames per second video, just like the R5. It'll do 4K 120 frames per second, albeit at 10% crop. And it has, well, a sophisticated heat dissipation system. So they are at least handling this public image of overheating better than what Canon did when they released their R5. That was a little bit of a PR disaster, although in reality, it seems like the heat issue is not really a problem in practice with the Canon R5 right now, but it was certainly controversial when it came out. Pretty much every video that came out with the R5 last year was talking about the heat dissipation and the video recording limit. So Sony has obviously tread this very carefully. They've got the images and the graphs and the press release imagery and data that talks about heat dissipation. They've obviously put through a lot of effort in there. It's officially rated at 30-minute limitations in shooting video in these settings. However, in practice, it seems like, well, it sounds like it's going to be doing a little bit better than that. In terms of the nitty-gritty, it'll do 4:2:2 10-bit video recording at S-Log3 with 15 plus stops dynamic range. But that's with the internal recording. With the external recording, it'll do up to 16-bit RAW via HDMI out. And mind you, it is a full-sized HDMI port. Here's a bit of trivia that I find interesting. It has the shutter closed when the camera is off. Now, on my Sony a7R Mark IV, I personally have very, very major issues with the sensor dust. Coming from the digital SLR, from the Canon 5DS Mark V, I never had to clean my sensor. With the Sony, I have to clean the sensor once every couple of shoots that I do, or especially if I change the lenses quite a lot. I don't really have that problem with digital SLRs. I don't really have that problem with my GH5 or my GH5S. But I do have that problem with the Sony a7R Mark IV. That sensor just seems to be a bit of a dust magnet, so I really appreciate the fact that when the camera is off, the shutter mechanism is closed, and hopefully that means that if I were to use these next generation Sony cameras or this Sony A1, then changing lenses will at least minimize the dust from getting into the sensor, and I won't have to go through that sensor cleaning process as often. It has 1.5 times less rolling shutter, so 50% reduction in rolling shutter. I never really noticed a problem in shooting cars when it comes to rolling shutter. I've had some experience with it before, shooting on the Canon 5DSR when it comes to doing panning and tracking shots of very fast cars in particular, but this is definitely going to be a welcome thing for sports shooters, motorsport photographers, which this camera is definitely aimed for with that 20 to 30 frames per second write speeds. Now, flash sync, that is very important what we do. It supports 1/200th of a second flash sync in electronic shutter mode, which is pretty amazing. So thanks to its incredibly fast sensor readout, even in electronic, completely silent shutter mode, it'll support 1/200th of a second flash sync speed. Now, in normal flash sync speed, the mechanical flash sync with the mechanical shutter, it's 1/400th of a second, which is marginally improved from what typical cameras in this category can do. In order to do better than that, I've typically gone with the Phase 1 XF camera system that I've rented for a lot of large commercial jobs. That supports, with its leaf shutter mechanism, 1/1600th of a second, so 1/1600 of a second shutter speed. But I believe with the leaf shutter lenses, yes, you can do flash sync up to 1/1600th of a second, but I believe your actual shutter speed is limited to be no faster than 1/1600th of a second shutter speed. If you use the normal focal plane shutters, then you get faster shutter speed limitations, but you don't get that fast X-Sync flash speed. I believe with the standard focal plane shutters on the Phase 1 XF camera system, the flash sync speed is only limited up to 1/125th of a second. So 1/400th of a second on the mechanical shutter is really quite amazing. It's really, really good when you need to do the photography, when especially you need to darken the skies, and darkening the skies without losing the power output of your flash. Because I've played with high speed sync before and you lose a lot of power, which pulses lights over a longer period of time, and the camera needs to support it as well as the flash. But with my Broncolor Ceros Ls, I can really make the most of it by using a flash sync speed that supports up to 1/400th of a second, especially when it comes to killing ambient sunlight. But interestingly, in APS-C mode, it supports 1/500th of a second mechanical sync speed. It has the updated menu that we first found in the Sony A7S Mark III. It does downgrade from the full flip screen of the Sony A7S III down to just a tilty screen like I assume on my Sony A7 Mark IV. It looks like it has the same screen type and resolution as with the other Sony Alpha cameras. I'm not a big fan of them. However, the EVF on the Sony is absolutely tremendous. It seems to have a similar or the same electronic viewfinder as the A7S Mark III, which was absolutely spectacular to look through and to use. So it makes up for the poorer screen, in my opinion, with an absolutely amazing electronic viewfinder. So I think this is a camera that is just meant to do everything. It's just meant to be the grand flagship camera, the holy grail camera from the Sony Pro mirrorless world. I also feel like this camera marks a very interesting change in direction, or a new direction for Sony, because traditionally, the way that I saw it is that Sony's camera systems have always been targeted towards different specialty groups. You've got the A7S Mark III that's specialized specifically for video, so it compromises on the stills and it compromises on its sports photography abilities in order to do better video capabilities. You have the Sony A7R Mark IV, like the camera that I use, which is specifically focused on stills. Of course, you can do stills with the Sony A7S and you can do video with the Sony A7R Mark IV, but it is clearly defined to be specialized cameras for the video shooter and for the stills focused shooter. And the A9 Mark II is more centered towards the sports shooter or the motorsport photographer. The A7 Mark III, or soon to be released the A7 Mark IV, is that hybrid camera that does a little bit of everything quite well, but I see it more as a mid-tier camera. And this is how it differs from Sony to Canon, because with Canon generally seems to do their professional camera lineup in tiers, where each model camera does everything as well as it can be, but by doing so, obviously it's not as specialized, and you do compromise on things in doing it that way. Some people prefer the more specialized directions of what Sony does, in being more specialized towards film, or being more specialized towards motorsport, or being more specialized towards stills. With Canon, as evidence with the Canon R5, it's a camera that tries to do a little bit of everything. It does very good sports photography, it does very good video capabilities, and it does very good stills capabilities as well. But 45 megapixels on the R5 versus 60 megapixels in the Sony A7R Mark IV, etc., etc. So the Canon is, when you have a hybrid camera, it really comes down to personal preference. Personally, with my kind of photography, my kind of work, and my kind of production, I prefer having specialized cameras like how Sony has traditionally done it. The reason being is because I will always have an assistant or a camera operator. So if we're trying to shoot, say, some tracking shots of a car on the racetrack, it's best for me to have a camera that's specifically there to shoot stills, like the Sony A7R Mark IV, and I can have a camera operator next to me over my shoulder who will have a dedicated video camera like the Sony A7S Mark III. Although I use the Blackmagic Pocket 4K and the GH5 at the moment. But that suits me more than having one camera that does both very well, because we can only shoot one thing at a time. On the other hand, some people are one-man bands, so if you're shooting a wedding entirely on your own, you may be better off having a hybrid camera that does a little bit of everything really well, like the Canon R5 and like this Sony A1, because you're a one-man band. Instead of carrying 2 or 3 cameras over your shoulders, you only have one camera, and when you can switch switch with that one camera between photo and video mode without having to switch camera bodies. So that's why I see this Sony A1 as being a very important, very crucial camera, because traditionally, if you wanted a hybrid camera from Sony, you would generally have to go with the A7 Mark III. But now if you want a really top tier camera that can do everything really well as a hybrid, you've got this Sony A1. It can do video well, it can do sports photography well, it can do stills photography very well. It's a no compromise, do everything camera, but you certainly pay for it. If I were to use a camera like this, I would probably have to buy two of them, and that's why at the moment I think I prefer the more specialist, more focused direction of having the A7R Mark IV for stills and having a dedicated video camera like the A7S Mark III or my Blackmagic Pocket 4K for doing video, and basically capturing both stills and videos at the same time whilst I'm shooting cars doing circles and laps around the racetrack. But of course, everyone is different, everyone's needs are different, and to some people, having a hybrid camera that can do everything all in the one body is an absolute godsend for them. And for them, I would say that this is most definitely the new holy grail camera. If you want the absolute best no holds barred camera that you can buy, the Sony A1 is definitely the camera to go with. Anyway, so what do you guys reckon? Should you buy this? Are you not going to buy this? Are you going to just wait and see what comes out? Is this just a camera that everyone's going to look at and drool over as a holy grail camera, but very, very few people are going to be able to afford to or buy this camera justifiably? Personally, what I'm super interested in is what Canon releases in response to this. I am sure they have something in the works already. We've seen the Canon R5, we've seen the Canon R6. I think it's inevitable that we're going to see some kind of Canon R1 that'll compete directly against the Sony A1. So we've seen what Sony has brought out, and it's only fair to see what Canon brings out, hopefully this year as well. Hopefully it won't take too long. But that's really exciting, and you know, here's to 2021 and awesome cameras.